Welcome all. My name is Diana. I'm here with the whole U, and we're thrilled to host our guests, the Snohomish Conservation District, on this presentation on sustainable gardening practices within our state. I'll go ahead and turn things over to Thomas, who can take the lead from here. Thank you, Thomas.
Yeah, thanks, Diana. All right, well, everyone, very glad to be here and presenting to you, and I'm happy to see that there was a fair amount of interest in this talk. And I was trying to maybe get some of my colleagues to come on as well. It's a busy summer. You've just got me today. I think that's okay. We can get through a lot of material, and that's my plan. So I plan to do a kind of a bird's eye view of the conservation district, what we do, and then how that relates to maybe some of the way we manage our properties and the places we live. So with that, I named this multi-benefit native landscapes because the way that some of these habitat restoration principles are shared between my habitat restoration work on rivers and streams and how we manage kind of our urban green areas, including our backyards, is really, there's a lot of shared principles here that have a lot of benefits. So more than just what I want to see in my yard and more than what the natural world might need or benefit from, there are shared interests here. And that's really what excites me and what I want to focus on a little bit. But again, it'll be bird's eye view. So throughout this presentation, I will be stopping to answer some questions, which can go in the chat, and I'll give space for that, and Diana can ask those questions as we go along. But please ask questions if you want more detail, if you want finer detail on anything I'm talking about, because I am kind of glossing over the surface on some of these ideas. So with that, I'd like to start talking about what a conservation district is. It's kind of a unique organization that a lot of people don't know what it is, and if they do, they don't quite know how it works. So basically, we're a special use district, an extension of state government that is non-regulatory. And we're kind of a child of the Dust Bowl. So preserving soil conservation and preserving natural resources is kind of our mission. But that mission is very intertwined with the people who live on the land. So whether it's our farmers, the people in the urban areas, the people on our rivers and streams, everyone who is interacting with the environment has a role to play in conservation. And so what we like to do is try and work cooperatively with everyone who is interested in conservation practices and provide them the resources and sometimes the funding to promote conservation on their land or in their schools. So we do everything from habitat restoration, which is what I focus on, to urban stormwater management. We work with a lot of agricultural producers and livestock managers to work with them on their land to increase conservation. And then we also have a youth education program where we work with students in schools to promote these principles to kind of bring up the next generation. So my name is Thomas Boltheis. I work as a habitat restoration project manager here at the Conservation District in Snohomish. I do work in Snohomish, and much of you might be in King County. King County has their own conservation district, and so there's Snohomish, there's King, and there's about 40 other ones across the state. So every county has some sort of representation in the conservation district world. So I happen to work in Snohomish. We're based out of Lake Stevens, and my primary focus is managing our riparian restoration, which I'll get into what that is in a second, but basically I'm working on rivers and streams to promote salmon habitat and water quality by working with those kind of near shore areas. You're welcome to contact me with this information. It'll be at the end with anything that comes up that you want more information on, or just to really just get in touch about anything that really interests you that I go over today. The goal of this presentation today is to really define riparian restoration so you have a solid understanding of what that is, what it might look like. So that'll be fairly brief, but then trying to translate those principles into what that means for you, your yard, and then even an extension to the green spaces you see in Seattle, throughout Western Washington, in the parks, in these kind of like peri-urban areas that are right between, it's not way out in the sticks, but it's not really the city anymore. And there's a lot of green space that we can work with that can have great benefit. So what do these principles mean for those areas? And then I want to talk about some plants and some kind of plant groupings that we think about. And I'm only going to go over a few of them. And these are kind of popular demand. So these are the ones that I get questions about the most from landowners trying to work in their parks on their properties. There's a whole host of ways we can organize plant groupings, and we'll go over, briefly mention some extras there, and we can do more detail based on people's questions and interest. And then we'll talk about where folks can get native plants, because I really want to leave here empowering everyone with just enough knowledge to pursue any sort of native plant restoration, whether it's in their backyard, volunteering with an organization. We all can play a role in increasing kind of the diversity and density of our native plants, and there's a lot of benefit to doing that. So that's my goal for today. So I'll start with riparian restoration and what it is and why we care about that. I mean, this is my job, and I care. I'm very passionate about it. But why should you care? Why is it something that you should know about and really have an understanding of? So when I say riparian, this might be a foreign word to you. It just means any land that's associated with rivers and streams. So we like to think of this as the stream interface. Where is the stream actually interacting with the shore and the floodplain? And how is that interaction changing the way that plants are growing, that animals are using the space? So we say it's a three-dimensional interface because we're going up and down through kind of the levels, the physical levels of the understory. And then we're going side to side. How far does this water and this influence extend into the land, into the floodplain before the land doesn't know there's a stream there, right? If the land knows there's a stream there, it acts differently because of the water table and the amount of water throughout the year. And then we have kind of the up and down, the corridors of the riparian area, these river miles that start from the upper watersheds all the way down to Puget Sound. These are all these like interconnected webs of nutrients, of animals, habitat for a lot of our species, especially salmon. So that's something I focus on, is how are we keeping our fish species happy and reproductive in these stream corridors. And these riparian areas, they're characterized by the kind of plants that are here and the kind of ecosystem dynamics we see. So I wrote here hydrophilic plants. That just means plants that like water, right? Where is this stream, this river affecting the land so that these plants that do like water are happy to live here because the water table is high enough for long enough throughout the year that these plants are happy to be in this space. The benefits of a healthy riparian area are stream complexity. We get a lot of overflow from these streams that are dumping nutrients onto the land and helping the soils develop. We have a natural hydrologic regime, which means we have floods in the winter and we have dry times in the summer, and all of our plants are adapted to that. So a very happy and healthy stream will reflect that and will kind of have this schedule of when water is here and when it's not, that is actually very beneficial to the land. A lot of that natural hydrology creates a lot of diversity in habitat and also in habitat in species, whole different palette of species we see, but also in the structure. We have giant trees in the floodplain, but we also have everything in between all the way to our ground covers. And that's really important for a lot of the species that use these forests. The riparian area is very good at managing pollutants. So as we get these flood events, anything that's in the water gets dumped onto the floodplain and it filters through the soil and it drops out a lot of pollutants, and the plants actually process those, help break them down. And then with a very healthy riparian system, we also have a resilience that we don't see with areas that are degraded or full of invasive species. So if we're gonna get a warming climate, if we're gonna get more weather events that are extreme, we want this resilience in our riparian areas, because these are kind of the arteries of our land. This is where the nutrients flow from the mountains down to Puget Sound, and then we have this cycle and we have this nutrient conveyor belt that if it's not resilient, we're not gonna get a lot of the benefit that is in the background of a lot of what we do, especially in Western Washington. So there's a lot of impacts, negative impacts that we've seen to our stream corridors, and that's part of what my job is kind of aims to fix, right? In a lot of ways, there's a lot of erosion. In the photo, you can see at one point, the trees and shrubs were taken away, and now you have nothing holding this bank in place, it's eroding. You see a lot of these little, these blue markers in the grass here, those are actually plant protectors, and there's little baby plants in there. So this is a project in process. Through a lot of this deforestation along our rivers and streams, because it's the best agricultural land, the best soils for production, we also start losing soils fairly quickly because there's nothing to hold them in place, and there's not really a cycle to regenerate topsoil. So slowly we're losing a lot of our really healthy soils. And then just by clearing these areas, we're losing the complexity of vegetation. We're losing that resilience, which means we're not filtering out pollutants as well, and we're not really creating a system that is able to provide the best habitat for the most species. And I want to quick focus on pollution because where I'm focusing on today is kind of this intersection between this rural areas and these urban areas, and this kind of space in between, and this weird green space that it has a very strong ecological function, but it also is easy to ignore because it's on this fringe of the urban area. And we don't want to ignore it. So if you look at this photo, you can see a lot of different land uses. This is up where I work in Arlington. So this is, you can see two rivers flowing towards the top of the photo. They confluence into one, and this is the north and south fork of the Snohomish River. But you can see a lot of agriculture. You can see the urban part of Arlington here. And then there's also some forestry parcels. There's some recreation areas. There's a county park up here. And this is just illustrating, there's a lot of inputs, a lot of uses on our land. So if you're reading the slide here, there's a lot of pollutants that we see in stormwater, a lot of nutrients from our agriculture, phosphorus and nitrogen being the big ones from fertilizer. In nutrients, temperature doesn't really belong. I think that's more of a typo here. But temperature is actually a pollutant because we take away the shade from the streams, and the sun just loads heat into our rivers and streams, which has a negative impact on all aquatic species, but especially our salmon. Once we get near 60 degrees, that's a lethal limit. So we have warm water. It's nice to swim in, not that great for our species, and we start seeing some mortality increases with warmer water. And then just the physical habitat, we have increased sedimentation, so we get a loss of these like riffles and pools in these streams, which is the structural diversity of our streams that species really latch onto, whether it's a pool or a riffle. That's where they're finding their home. If that's not there, they can't do that. So there's a lot of degradation that happens when we have so many different land uses. And that's not to say we can't fix this or have more responsible land uses. It means there's an impact and there's some work to do to try and solve some of the impacts we've seen. So what might restoration look like? And I threw these slides in pretty quickly, but restoration in the scope of what I do is removing invasive species, increasing the abundance and diversity of native species, and then keeping them alive long enough that they can actually compete with recurring native species, different land uses, until we have a functioning stream. So here we have a couple photos of a large blackberry patch. I'm sure everyone's familiar with the blackberries around here. And the kind of site prep, we need to remove this. A lot of labor. So this is just an illustration of the kind of labor that goes into some of our projects. Once we do this, we need to keep it at bay. So this means you cut it down, it's going to keep coming back until we take it out of the ground or we kill it in some other way. After that, we spend a lot of time planting. We will plant native trees and shrubs at anywhere from 700 to 1,200 plants per acre. To give you a perspective, that's anywhere from 7 feet apart to as close as 4 feet apart. So very densely, a lot of plants on the landscape. Understanding that some of these die when they're young, and that we want to create a system that is supporting itself, and each plant supports each other. So the closer they are together, they create a small microclimate. They create a place where invasive species have a hard time penetrating after they've been removed. So after we plant, we do a lot of site maintenance. The first 3 years is where we really want to care about our plants, watch them closely, and keep the invasive species away. So here you see a photo of one of our crew members just working on this invasive reed canary grass that is crowding out our plants. This is a very common invasive species, but our goal is to get all of our plants surviving to the point where they can survive without us. So we call that the free to grow stage. So we usually, and our funding sources are kind of structured around this. We have enough money for long enough that we can get our trees large enough so that they survive without intervention from us. And that's the goal. We want to leave these to really develop and become their own wild systems that they were really meant to be and how they used to be. So here's a photo of a stream of a very healthy riparian area. This is not a restoration project. This is kind of a beautiful salmon stream. But this is kind of the goal of what we're looking for. I hope that my projects in 50 years are looking like this, that there's a lot of shade, there's a lot of different sizes of rocks in the stream bed, and that it really looks like great habitat. But something you will notice is it's very messy. It's kind of thick. You wouldn't really want to walk through there, right? There's a lot going on. This is what healthy riparian restoration looks like. On the contrary, you in your yard, you have places that you want to manage. We have parks that we want to manage, and we have areas that we still want to use. And so this is where the multi-benefit part comes in. There's a lot of benefits to restoration for its own sake, and that's really what I'm in it for. But not all of us have this land to set aside just for that, right? We live on the landscape and we interact with it. So we need to find a way that it works for all of us, but we still want to live lightly on the land. So is there a way we can do that? I focus on riparian restoration. Not everyone has a stream going through their local park or their backyard, and that's okay. Everywhere on the landscape is part of this grand system that everything kind of trickles down either to a stream or lays in the environment in a way that has future impacts. So the smaller impact we can make, then the longer that we have kind of these viable environments in which we can live and benefit from, and also have species thrive in. So this leads us to natural yard care. Natural yard care is kind of how we promote kind of these urban areas to manage their land in a way that is going to live lightly, is going to manage a lot of the negative impacts that we see from most urban areas. So the 5 steps are healthy soil, plant right, so use the right plants, water intelligently, smart watering, avoid using chemicals that we don't have to use, and then natural lawn care, which we'll talk about a little bit, but some different strategies for basically grass alternatives. So we'll dive right in and we'll go through these in kind of a mixed order, but we'll hit them all just a little bit until we get to plants, and then I'll focus on that one last. So I'm not a soil scientist. I don't usually teach anyone about soils. So this is very basic. But when we're working on the landscape, we have a lot of soil layers. And it's really these first couple layers that you see in this graphic that are really what is promoting this really vigorous plant growth. So this is where there's a lot of organic matter. This is where if you have healthy soil, you get this really dark, really good looking dirt, right? And it's full of living organisms, and it's something that we should cherish. And it's also something that is quite fragile if we don't manage our landscapes properly. We have a lot of nutrients that are available when we have water coming through. They're water soluble. So this is nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. These are the main ones that you'll see in fertilizers. And they come in these granular pellets because as you water over them, they dissolve in water and become bioavailable, which means they're sitting in these top layers and the roots are able to actually absorb those nutrients pretty easily. There's ways to increase these bioavailable nutrients without using too many foreign products such as fertilizers. And that's what I have at the bottom here. Mulching is a good way to let organic matter decompose and provide more nutrients. Planting can actually support soil health. Some plants actually will add nutrients to the soil, such as nitrogen fixing plants. People with clover lawns will know this. Clover is nitrogen fixing, so they have much more nitrogen in the soil which is a nutrient that's lost from the soil very easily. So a great grass alternative is clover. And a lot of times we just need to leave our landscape as it is and let things fall and decompose as they are. And that creates kind of this natural sustainable mulch. Your leaves fall in the autumn and we have a lot of just free mulch on the ground. And yes, it'll kill your grass. You can clear it from the grass, but in a lot of ways, these leaves breaking down are creating a lot of nutrients that are bioavailable. And if we take that away, we're kind of losing some of that sustainable nutrient cycle in the soil. Another part of how we promote natives on the landscape is if we can learn to like the way it looks, these native plants, right? There's a Pacific Northwest aesthetic that we all like. We're kind of drawn to it in a lot of ways, and most of us like that about the place we live. So if we put this on our own landscapes, we have plants that are adapted to our environment, and so that means our super wet winters and our droughty summers. Maybe not this one, but most summers there's not a lot of rain, and so we have plants that have adapted that over thousands of years. So putting those on the landscape means less watering, less use of resources, and just less work for us as we're trying to manage a certain aesthetic, or we're trying to manage a certain space and not let it encroach on others. And another piece of this is as we're watering, I don't know if any of you have rain barrels on your homes or you've seen them on churches or schools, but rain barrels are a way to capture the storm water that's coming off of our roofs and spread it out on our landscape so it's not going straight onto your driveway, onto the road, on this impervious surface, straight into the storm drain. We're actually letting that percolate through the soil much slower, and we're saving city water and preventing kind of the storm problems from stormwater that we often see, mostly related to pollution. But I won't go into that too much right now. We try and ask people not to use herbicides as much as they can, and taking out your invasive species, those plants you don't want, by hand, shading them out for those sun-loving species, and then mulching them, just smothering them with some sort of organic material, are all effective ways to manage undesirable species without chemicals. So that was a quick bang through those first four so that we can talk about plants. Our native plants are kind of the workhorses of our environment, and I'd like to just talk about what our goals are when we try and put these on the landscape, and how we can match those goals with what our personal goals are on our yards or in our parks. What kind of factors should we be thinking about? So I have about 4 or 5, what I might call goals here, and these are what people call in and ask me about the most when they say, "Hey, I've got a backyard, and this is what I need to know how to do. What plants should I put in here?" So some of those things are where we have a lot of shade on the landscape, a lot of sun. Is it very wet? Is it very dry? Do we like birds? Do we like pollinators? So we can kind of group plants for each of those. But before we do that, I want to recall this slide that I showed earlier about habitat benefits, because when we talk about the work I do, riparian restoration, it very often seems divorced from kind of this urban management of our yards, and it seems like, oh, this is just me trying to make it pretty. But I really want to hit home the idea that the same habitat benefits that we see in the riparian area are things that we can promote on our own urban and kind of like semi-urban landscapes. So say for stream complexity, which not all of us have streams around, but managing our stormwater is managing a natural hydrological regime, which is important for our stormwater management. Increasing habitat diversity through these native plants that a lot of species know how to use and would like to use is increasing kind of the resilience of our ecosystems, and all the pollutants in the urban area are effectively being managed well by native plants. Plants that require less water, less maintenance, and are actually working very hard to clean up our air, clean up our soils, and manage a lot of the pollutants that we are putting into the system. So I want to remember that, because we're not working just outside just on these streams, and we're not working just in urban areas. These are very similar goals with very similar outcomes, just on different scales, right? Our yards are small, but everything counts, and a patchwork of these efforts is really what's going to make the biggest difference for reversing some of the negative impacts we see. So, planting with a purpose. What are our goals on our landscape, and what are those factors that are limiting the type of plants that we can put out here? Because not all native plants have adapted to work in all situations in the Pacific Northwest. Right? We know wetlands are very different from kind of our high-end dry prairies, right? So these work differently, and our yards are likewise very different. So we have different goals and different kind of different bounds for what plants we can choose. So first of all, if we have plants in the sun, here's a list of kind of the main plants that we will often use for planting in these very, very exposed areas that get a lot of sun throughout the day, and usually dry out quite a bit in the summertime. Especially, when we're thinking about soils in these like very exposed sunny areas. In the urban area, those soils are not always the historic soils that were here, but they could be fill from when they built the basement and they dumped it in the backyard. And what is that? That's very deep soil, glacial till, that is very rocky and not very nutrient rich. So not all of our yards even have a really deep organic and bioavailable soil layer. So we need to keep that in mind. But another thing that happens is they drain very, very quickly. So even when we get rain, some of these soils drain very fast. So the plants on this list are adapted well to have like very droughty conditions. When we say droughty, we mean not getting rain for an extended period of time. So our summers are technically drought periods, even though we're in Western Washington and it rains so much throughout the year. If we get 3 months without rain, that's technically a drought, and we have this kind of small annual drought that happens. These plants here are really adapted to manage that well in areas that do not hold water for a larger part of the year than maybe some of our wetland or actual riparian areas. If anyone has more questions about these species specifically, feel free to email me, put them in the comments if you want more information. After I go through some of these different planting groups, I'll stop for questions and we can talk more about specifics of any one of these slides. But I don't want to go into it now because I don't want to run out of time. So that's what sun planting will look like, and these are a lot of the plants that I use. Save for some of the bottom ones, goldenrod, lupin. Those are kind of our pollinator species, which we'll see in a second, but they're also they're very low growing, and we don't use those in restoration as much as pollinator gardens, hedgerows, and kind of these smaller areas where we can manage them more closely. Just because of invasive pressures, we stick to trees and shrubs, but there's a lot of wonderful native flowers and ground covers that are going to do a lot for our backyards for a lot of our species. So on the contrary to full sun is full shade, and we have a lot of that. We have a lot of big trees, we have dark winters, we get a lot of shade, not a lot of sunlight available. And so these species here are very, very good, and you'll see these going on hikes, right? They're very good at living in these dense understories that stay very moist and don't get a lot of sun throughout the day. Maybe they'll get some dappled sunlight throughout the day, or they'll get 2 hours of direct sun, but that's it. And that's only when the sun's at the right angle. And so we manage accordingly by planting these trees and shrubs that are really going to be happy underneath, growing underneath some like pretty intense cover. I want to point out this graphic on the bottom is a planting plan that I pulled from King County's native plant webpage, which I can send out the link later. But King County has some really great resources for you to be able to create plant lists based on your preferences or your property's preferences. Full shade, full sun, what are you looking for? And they will divide a list, and you can start picking out plants based on the kind of property you had. I'm not going through plants that are just really ideal for this like part sun, part shade, but there's plants that are in between there, and that's more of the complexity that as you do research, you'll want to think about where's the sun on the property, is this going to be happy where I'm planting it? What I'm also not going through here in detail is the water availability. Some soils don't hold water and some hold a lot of water. And basically the infiltration is slower or faster in different soils. And that changes what kind of water is available for these plants and for how long. How fast is that water just draining away? And that changes what type of plants that we plant. So I'm not going to go into that here, but these are just considerations that as we start thinking about what are the correct native plants for the landscape, we want to talk about it. And I don't want it to be overwhelming for anyone. Some of the resources that I will share with you make it very, very easy to make your own plant list and do a quasi restoration project, even if it's just in a backyard, to bring in native species to where you live. Another thing that we get a lot of questions about is how can I plant for the birds? If any of you are birders, you know there's a lot of plants that birds will gravitate to. They'll like to use a lot of different fruits, vegetables for their food and forage, and they also like to find homes, nesting sites. And a lot of our native birds have adapted to the native plants that they've had for hundreds of years. So as we plant these species, the birds like to use them, and they know how to use them, and it's what they recognize and what they can use well. When we plant for birds, we like to plant a lot of different ones. So the diversity of resources for our birds is what brings them to a property, but also keeps them around and makes it feel like a resource-rich area where we can have. It's almost like planting a bird feeder around, and it's seasonal, so it's not like you're just throwing seed in a bird feeder. You have kind of the seasonal timing of each of these plants that the birds can come through and forage throughout the year as the fruits ripen and as the plants become a resource that they want to use. So again, I will not read all of these. I'm not a birder. I'm sure some of you listening could tell me more about birds than I've ever known so far, and that's great. But I want you to know that there are lots of plants that a lot of our native birds use, and bird habitat, it has been reduced in urban areas very significantly. As we have migrating birds, they're looking for food and forage. They're looking for places to nest. They're looking for safety. And if our backyard habitats can be a little refuge for birds in our neighborhood or migrating through, that's a huge benefit to kind of the habitat at large. Similar to birds, our pollinators are a huge workforce for a lot of our agriculture, a lot of our gardens, a lot of our trees. We depend on pollinators more than I think we understand. I don't know if we can understand until we don't have them anymore, and it would be very, very sad to get to that point. So here is a list of pollinator-friendly plants that attract pollinators. This is a short list. There are more, and there's lots of resources that we can look through to plant even more diversity of plants for our pollinators. But native plants work best. And when we plant them, we want to put them in kind of these dense patches. And proximity matters, as in a pollinator is very small, right? These are small insects. And so we don't want them to have to travel. Not that they can't, but we don't want them to have to travel very far just to find more plants and more flowers. So the closer they are together, the more likely we're going to have active pollination on our properties. So that means dense groups of plantings are more attractive than kind of flowers here and flowers over there, and they're kind of spread throughout your yard. Those dense clusters are actually going to be the most beneficial. You've probably all seen those really dense lavender bunches in people's yards, and they're just like teeming with bumblebees because there's so much resource right there. And that's how we want to plant our native species as well. Another one is for those of us who have wet properties. We have different considerations to make, and we want to make sure that we have plants that will survive and not create space for invasive species to come in. So if we're in urban areas, there's not a lot of wetlands. The wetlands are cherished and they're few and far between. Most private properties don't have wetlands because they're kind of a nuisance to most people. They're messy, they sometimes smell, they're not really usable, and recreation is very difficult. However, a lot of people in Seattle increasingly have rain gardens in their front yards and their backyards to help manage stormwater. And so this is where a wetland plant list really comes in handy, because with a rain garden, we are trying to simulate a wetland and the type of infiltration that a wetland encourages, so that when we're managing our stormwater, we can put it into the ground at a rate that is suitable for the amount of rain we're getting, and in a way that we can actually help start to percolate this water down and filter out nutrients. So here we have trees and shrubs that are very suitable for wet conditions. And then we also have emergent species. An emergent species is one that, the easiest way to say it is it likes to have wet feet for most of the year. So in those areas, the kind of the bottom of the rain garden. So if you're looking at this graphic, the middle of these concentric circles is usually the lowest point. And that's where most of the water is going to sit and be wettest for longest. So that's where we put things like our sedges and our rushes that are going to really enjoy being wet for long periods of time. Also great for these emergents. They filter nutrients probably better than any of our other species. So they're very, very valuable. As we kind of take out our wetlands, we're losing a lot of that function. So rain gardens, very good. Wetlands, very, very valuable across the landscape. All right, so those are the quick ones that I get asked a lot of questions about. The one that I regret actually spending more time on is the second one here, edible plants. A lot of people are interested in planting native edibles, whether that's a way to experience some of the indigenous heritage and kind of learn your way into and appreciate a culture that you would like to appreciate more, or just a way to harvest on your property with native plants that are happy to grow there. It's a wonderful thing to do. And it's a great thing to learn. So I'd encourage everyone to go out and see if you can learn from a reputable source which plants have edible products, which ones can you use, and how they might fit on your landscape. Other considerations are bloom time. If we're going for aesthetics, we want to think about when are our plants blooming. But not only that, when are they going to come out, leaf out in the spring, right? We have an oso berry that is one of the first ones to leaf out. And then we also have some of our, say, the vine maple, that actually the leaves don't come out till a little bit later. But you might want a vine maple if you like the fall color, because vine maples turn a brilliant bright red, usually early in the fall. So you get a lot of this great color, and it can be a nice feature in your property while still providing these native plant benefits. So bloom time and kind of the timing of leaf change and leaf off is important for a lot of people to kind of manage their aesthetic space throughout the year. If you have deer or other pests, rodents, anything that's going to be eating your plants, there's some plants that are not palatable, and those might be things that you'd want to focus on. We are pretty cramped in Seattle sometimes, and so places in urban areas where you have small spaces, narrow spaces, if you're trying to plant in raised beds or in pots because you have a small patio, you can still incorporate native plants here. There's different plants that are going to really thrive in these spaces more than others. So there's lists for that too. And then if you have a steep slope or a slope in general, there are rooting systems that are deeper or have more root mass that are going to hold soil just a little bit better than some of our others. So if we're trying to stabilize a slope, there are plants that we like planting because the root systems are doing more work to stabilize that soil. So we don't actually just have to put up a wall sometimes and hold all that soil back. We can plant a bunch of trees and get kind of a multi-benefit that way. Great, so I'd like to stop right now and see if there's any questions that came up, because I did rush through a lot of plants, a lot of different features here. So Diana, if you can pass any questions to me, I'd love to take some of those.
Absolutely, yeah, we did have a few questions come up starting at the very top about grass. So I know you've spoken to invasive species before. Someone had asked, how do you get rid of canary grass?
Yeah, it's difficult, and it takes a lot of persistence. So there's a few ways we do it. Where we're able to, and in my job, we're able to a lot, we plant very densely live cuttings of willow. So as we cut branches off of willow and you stick them in the ground, and they have special cells that just start sending out roots, and then you have a tree. If we plant those 3 feet apart and they grow up and they shade out that grass, over 5 years, we start seeing a reduced density of that reed canary grass. Not all of us have the space, the time, or the resources to plant willow species. So some people will just dig it up. That's not really a viable option. As you will probably likely know, the root mass is huge and you'd be digging a giant hole. So some people do that, it works, but it does alter your landscape. The last way is using herbicide. A lot of people do use that over a couple years, is very effective. So if you're comfortable with doing that, it is an effective way to manage the grass. It's not necessarily the most comfortable, and you have to be very careful to follow the label instructions to make sure you're not over applying a chemical that could be potentially harmful if used inappropriately. So I hope that's helpful.
Thank you. Yeah, and please let me know if this is going to be a similar solution. I had a few questions about invasive species. Another one was, what's the best way to get rid of invasive morning glory?
Yeah, morning glory is very, very persistent. And the best way, honestly, is physical removal and just persistence. And that's the way with a lot of these species. If we're not using chemicals, it's just going to be a lot of persistence, and persistence pays off, and it's kind of a ongoing management, and it's a commitment that doesn't feel very clean sometimes, because you always have to come back because it's always growing, it's always pesky. And so not really maybe the answer anyone wants to hear, but it is definitely the preferable option when we're dealing with morning glory, even the blackberries that we see just about everywhere.
Yes, thank you so much for that. Along the same lines, we've got another question about invasive species. This one wrote, I saw cottonwood on your riparian diagram. It seems like the cotton in the air has become much more dense in the recent years. What is going on with that, and are they considered an invasive species?
Yeah, that's a great question. So cottonwood is a native species. It is not usually a preferred native species for a lot of landowners, but it is a really, really important one for our riparian areas especially. It's not preferred because it grows very fast, gets very tall, but it's also very fragile. So we get a lot of limb fall from that. So that's why some people really don't like it. They don't want to see it on the landscape because it poses a risk to a lot of structures. Cottonwood is very responsive to kind of nutrient cycles and weather cycles. And so I don't think there's anything very significant with increased cotton in the air besides every couple of years you get, it's kind of like with our oak trees, you get a mast year when it produces so many acorns compared to the year before. And that's similar with a lot of our plants as they produce seeds, is that some years you just get really, really dense kind of seed production. And it's not, it's usually based on nutrients and kind of the weather cycles, or it's just a plant timeline. There's a lot that we don't know about some of these things. But I don't think there's anything more significant than sometimes the plants just produce lots and lots of seeds.
Thank you. And we got one more regarding the invasive species. For Japanese knotweed, is digging out also the best way to get rid of them?
Probably not. If you have a very small stand with, and this is probably like smaller than, like this is 10 by 10. If it's smaller than 10 by 10, you can try and dig it out. That's still a huge effort. The thing with knotweed is it evolved to have very, very fragile and very fine root systems. So it's meant to break, and it's meant to distribute by its roots, because all those roots can produce another plant. So if we are digging it up and we're not getting all the roots, which I guarantee you will never get all the roots, then you might be spreading and producing more plants. So it could get worse if you're not extremely thorough. So most professional restoration practitioners to control knotweed are using herbicides, and it's probably the only consistent way to do it on the kind of timeline that we're hoping to control it. Some people will use kind of this like very thick weed cloth to shade it out for years and years, but you would be surprised how resilient this knotweed can be with no sun. The root systems carry energy for a long time, and it's pretty discouraging to have a tarp on your ground for 3 or 4 years, and then the knotweed just is either growing through it, or when you pull it off, it starts growing again. So currently, herbicide is the only way that we can control it. If you have some on your property, you can reach out to me and I can give you more information on how to do that responsibly, but I won't go into that right now.
Great, thank you. We're going to shift now to this next set of questions about the local environmental impact. A question was asked, could you comment or discuss the impact of local beavers?
Yeah, I'd love to. Also, another can of worms that probably shouldn't go too far into. Beavers are incredibly important for our landscape and are currently still at sub-historic levels of their populations. The reasons that they're very important is the same reasons why wetlands are important, or they are the creators of wetlands. So they're almost wetland engineers. So they keep water on the landscape for longer. They really support subsurface groundwater, like this infiltration that is very slow. So one of our problems with our rivers is in the summer, they get very, very low and they get very, very hot. The more wetlands we have, especially beaver wetlands, will actually help more water infiltrate slowly. So it's actually entering our rivers later in the summer, and it's cold. It's been underground all year, so it's still cold. So we're actually supporting stream flow with cold water and keeping enough cold water in the stream for a lot of our salmon species. Additionally, wetlands are an incredible resource for many, many species and really promote water quality. So the more wetlands we have on the landscape, which means the more beavers that are creating wetlands, is a very positive thing. Now there's a lot of there's a lot of dispute with beavers because they do kind of put a lot of our structures at risk. And again, so from my perspective, beavers are great on the landscape. I will promote them. At the same time, we want to work cooperatively with landowners who have beavers that are negatively affecting any of their structures and their property, to try and work together so we're not just killing beavers, because it doesn't work. They always come back. So there's ways to work with them. And again, if you would like more information on how we manage beavers on the landscape, I'd be happy to send you more resources and chat further.
Great. And along the same question, what about moles?
Voles?
Moles.
Moles. I probably can't speak much to it. I don't encounter a lot of different rodents. There is sometimes like a stream bank structure issue with burrowing animals, and that's the same on steep slopes. A lot of the ravines we have in kind of our city parks are around ravines oftentimes, and there's a lot of rodents that are burrowing and creating erosion. That's as far as I can say. We don't manage them directly.
Wonderful. Are there any new developments regarding or information regarding the impact of chemicals from tires and its impact on salmon species?
I don't think there's any updates. The quick review is that there are compounds in our tires that as they wear off onto our roads and enter the stormwater system and into our creeks, there's a chemical that specifically will kill coho salmon very, very quickly. And this is very recent development. I don't have any new information there, but we are working on installing more of these rain gardens, bioswales, way to manage our stormwater and filter it out before it enters our streams, because that is proving to be effective in filtering out some of these nutrients and holding them in the soil to let them break down. But it's still there. It's still a very large problem, and I think a lot of the scientists are still trying to figure out what a good solution is, but I've not heard any new updates.
Wonderful, thank you.
Yeah.
We are going to shift to the next set of questions around soil. So, are there certain plants and strategies that are best for planting or improving soil? That is fill.
That is fill. So usually fill is introduced sometimes just dirt. So the difference between dirt and soil is the living organisms that are in it. So if you have fill material, it usually doesn't have a lot of organic matter or living organisms. I don't know specific plants. And again, I'm not really a soil specialist. What I can tell you is deeper rooting plants are very good at breaking up soil, creating more porosity in the soil, so more space for water to infiltrate, nutrients to kind of bind onto some of that dirt. But I think the real effort would be keeping a mulch layer on top to let that break down and infiltrate the soil. And then allowing, if we can find, and I'm sorry, I don't have the best answer, but deep rooting native plants are really the ones that are going to help condition that soil over time in the best way.
Great. Some more questions about a rain garden, actually. What is a good resource for how to build a rain garden? I have wetlands on my lot in SeaTac and would love to do some restoration there.
Yeah, I can send. So I think the best way to answer this question is I will provide Diana a link to send out to you all with the Washington kind of rain garden handbook, which is the best way to understand what it is, how you might go about building it, and start to envision what a plan would look like on your property. But I don't know the best kind of contractors or avenues to get that done. Sometimes local jurisdictions like SeaTac might have a program. I know City of Seattle does. Monroe up here does, but I don't know them specifically for every city. But I'll have that sent out, and then you can have a look and try and find local resources to help.
Wonderful. Great. And we had a few questions come up as well, more about invasive species. Do you have any advice on getting rid of spreading bamboo?
Oh my. Spreading bamboo is a real pest. So if you don't actually keep the roots contained, it spreads like crazy. The best way is to dig it up. I mean, if you have, if there's money and space available, a lot of people will dig it up, but that's not really a realistic approach for most people. There are herbicide applications that work. But again, you're putting chemicals into the landscape, so that might not be kind of your best option or your most preferable one, but it can work. Short of those two options, I don't have a lot for you. I think, digging it out as much as we can, or just containing it while it's there, is probably the best you can do. But I don't deal with it very much on our native landscapes. So good luck. I think manual control is going to be, the most preferable option. Herbicide can work, but I'm not really aware of which chemicals or kind of the technique that you would use for that.
Thank you. And another one about invasive species, this time one about blackberries. Noticing an influx of blackberries along the majority of shorelines in Everett. What is its impact on the ecosystem?
Yeah, so blackberry first and foremost will smother out just about all of our small, and once it's there, it's very, very thick. And so nothing is really regenerating under that. Blackberry does not provide a lot of shade for the streams, so it's not keeping our waters cool, and it's not providing a very diverse habitat, right? A lot of small animals will run in there. It's great shelter, but it's not actually providing the kind of habitat that is supporting like insect biology that's helping our salmon feed throughout the year. And it's not really supporting a really useful habitat corridor. So those are probably the first two. That it's really preventing the regeneration of kind of a native forest or floodplain community.
I see. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
And we've got a few more questions now, this time about programming over at the Snohomish Conservation District. One of the first questions I'd gotten is asking about whether or not the Snohomish Conservation District has a consulting service program.
So within our boundary, so it's basically the boundary of Snohomish County, we provide free technical assistance site visits. So that is similar to consulting, I suppose, where, part of what our mission is to help people with conservation. So we will take a call from anyone in Snohomish County, and we will go out and address their concerns by talking through what their vision for their property is, what problems they're having, and seeing what kind of assistance we can give them. Very rarely, but sometimes we actually have funding sources available to help solve these problems. More often than not, we provide kind of the avenues and tools for people to find a solution.
That's fantastic. And let's see, are there any classes or walks that you offer that you'd be aware of, with adjacent programming for folks to become familiar with native plant species and restoration?
Gosh, that's a good question. I don't have a good answer. We don't usually do a lot of programming. We have occasional, most of what we do is events kind of like this, where we'll give talks and we'll field questions. And then a lot of the, if someone in Snohomish County wanted to learn more about the native plants on their property, they call us up and we say, hey, I'll give you a site visit. We'll go and we'll walk the property and we'll do that. We don't hold a lot of walks. I'm not really aware of, at least local to me here in Snohomish County, of who would be doing that. I know there's a lot of great volunteer events through the Green City Partnership with Forterra. So a lot of our cities around Puget Sound have a partnership where there's a lot of volunteer events to do restoration, which is also an opportunity to learn. So I would check with your city. If they're part of a Green City Partnership, then there's a possibility to link up with some of these habitat restoration events.
Fantastic. And one more question that was just submitted. Folks that live near the Snohomish County, would they be allowed to attack or remove invasive species if they're in the green belts of the county? Or if not, will anyone do that at the county level?
That's a good question. And I'll have to walk a line here. We are not the county, so I can't speak for county code. So likely these greenways are part of a native growth protection area, which has some code rules that is managed by Snohomish County, and I shouldn't interpret those. What I can say is most of these codes do allow the removal of invasive species. But on a large scale, this definitely needs to have permission from the county. So there need to be coordination there. And I actually don't know the status of where the county is focusing. I know they focus most on green spaces with waterways going through them. But you're always able to reach out to the county. And I don't know the contacts there, but on their website, I'm sure there'd be contacts to find to express your concerns and kind of work through a process to try and get some of these species controlled.
That is wonderful. And that was our last question. We are at the top of the hour.
Yeah.
Just wanted to thank you again for taking the time to meet and talk with us about the Snohomish Conservation District and all of this wonderful information around sustaining native plants in our community. I'll be happy to send all attendees any information as well as this presentation deck and the link to this recording. Thomas, is there anything else you want to share with us before we head out?
Yeah, I had a few more slides here that are mostly just about how you can get plants if you need. So acquiring plants, I would look at your native plant nurseries. But the one plug I wanted to give was conservation districts. So King Conservation District, I think Pierce Conservation District, Snohomish, we all hold an annual plant sale where we sell native plants for anyone who wants to buy them, and they're usually at a reduced price than what you'd find at the nurseries. So it's a great resource for those of you who are trying to do some planting to find those plants that you can be confident are coming from great sources. Whoops, I'm going backwards here. And then the last thing, and all these links we'll put in an email with Diana, so I won't go through them, but there's a lot of resources that I'll be sending your way through Diana to get more information. And then lastly, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for your interest and questions. It's encouraging to hear people are dedicated, or this is a meaningful conversation to have, and I'm happy to continue any of these. So take down my contact info, shoot me an email if you have more questions that I didn't get to or are lingering. So thank you all.
Thanks, everyone. And thank you, Thomas. Look forward to sharing that information with you. And it's, again, so great for all of us to gather and share this space. Great to see your faces as well. The link will be going out very shortly. Thank you.